the political side of it, and then there's the real story.
There's a lot to unpack right there. It wasn't quite the interview I thought that was going to be.
There's a reason for it.
This will be officially my favorite podcast I've ever
You know,
done.
obviously something near and dear to my heart is roll-ups. I've done a lot of public deals, brought a lot of companies public. And obviously, I run a public company now on the New York Stock Exchange. I think we got about close to 650 million in assets. And I know you're doing a roll-up. Is that in the MSP space? What space are you doing a roll-up in?
It is, yeah, you got it, in the MSP space.
You know, it's like maybe you could explain to the audience, it's like a utility. I actually know a bunch of people in this space, especially in Michigan, and it's really like a utility. Like once a bank, I've seen banks talk about like once they get an MSP, they really can't get out of that relationship. So you become like a sticky part of the business owner's environment. Can you explain to people what an MSP is?
Yeah, it's an acronym I don't really like anymore because nobody really, it's great that you know what it is, but most don't even know what it is. It's like I've got the IT guy, right? That's kind of the phrasing that a lot use. An MSP is a managed service provider. Now, my take on an MSP is a little different than most of the industry because most of the industry is still billing time and materials, right? Labor, they do a small recurring fee, whereas I fully believe in a full fixed flat fee for literally everything that you might need.
Wow.
And that's the model that we're scaling out, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. And that's even worse when it comes to a competency with most MSPs because the Department of Homeland Security puts it only about 8% actually really know what they're doing when it comes to cyber. And I speak all around and I raise my hand in front of MSPs. It's like, how many layers do you have? We call it a stack, right? And we'll raise our hands and like, if you have 5, raise your hand. If you have 10, raise your hand. You know, put them down when I keep going up. Everybody's hand goes down in the room, you know, and there's 1,000 people in the room with maybe around 15. And ReachOut gets up to 34 different security layers. And there's a reason for that. And I'm not even saying that I know how to personally use all of them. I just know that we have to deliver something that works. And that's the difference, man, is that there's a lot of half-assedness that happens, and that's not part of my deal, right? I'm all in.
Yeah, speaking of your podcast, we ourselves have been hacked, and you can tell it's usually like a phishing attack where someone in the company will open an email and sort of let them in the door. People have faked emails and said they were me to my staff. I can think of one in particular where a colleague of mine was supposed to wire $135,000 to close an escrow. 5 minutes later, the email came back and it looked almost exactly the same, but with an S on the end. And it said, sorry, I want you to wire 1.35 million, apologize for the mistake. And the wire instructions were incorrect, put them here. And that staff member actually queued up the wire. And if it wasn't for Citibank, that 1.35 million would have went because the Citibank got the wire. It was so unusual that they called the person in charge of wiring and said, we understand you want to send 1.35 million to this Chinese bank. We need a verbal on this. And he's like, of course, stopped it. But his assistant already had approved it. So now we've gotten pinched. We've actually publicly disclosed that we've been under attack pretty hard. What are some of the things that people can do to stop it? Because it seems like to me it's relentless now. And before you answer that, I say that in conjunction with if you're in Bangladesh and you get one hit of 100 grand or 50 grand, it's like a lifetime's of earnings. So these guys are over there, they have all day to fish and try to attack.
Yeah, you're hitting on a couple of great points there. The last one, and then I'll go in reverse, is I love doing this when I speak publicly because if it's in the industry, outside the industry, if I'm talking about cybersecurity, I talk a lot about entrepreneurship too. I mean, my entire podcast is about growth and business and personal motivation. But when it comes to the business of cybersecurity or the business of hacking, really, these e-crime groups, you hit the nail on the head. I'll show a family on a slide from like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, as you mentioned, and say, these are the faces. It's not some dude in this hood in a dark back corner somewhere like you see in the movies or you see depicted on major media. It's a real life family, and it's just like Pablo Escobar. Right? With kids, this is their business. This is how they put food on the table. And even more so, like you're saying, it's like it is a lifetime of earnings. If they hit a big score like that, they're taken care of for life. But then, of course, greed allows them to keep going. It's just the psychology of all this, too.
Right.
You mentioned 1.35 million, and we just took back a client about 3 months ago, and they got hit similar scenario, right? Except, thank God for Citibank and the one you just described, they caught it. In the one where our client called us up and said, hey, save us, Wells Fargo didn't catch it. 1.6 million went out the door. We recovered about 1.4 million with the help of the FBI and the Secret Service.
Right.
And those guys do not even touch it. This is the horribleness. Is that a word, horribleness? I'll take it. This is the reality, too, is that if it's under $1 million, the FBI and the Secret Service don't touch it. That's really kind of their threshold. So I was actually kind of excited that the damages were that high. Like, cool, we can bring in the big guns for this to try to help us recover this.
We had one for a payroll issue where the employee, both them sent in, please route my check to this new account. We should have known. I don't know how that got through us, but so the payroll went to the wrong account for 2 employees, and then of course they said, hey, I didn't get my payroll check. But believe it or not, the bank gave us back the money. They were able to recover it. So, I mean, the interesting logic is they know where you're sending it, so I guess they have to drain that account quick enough or something. But we are all on high alert here, and I bet your services are in big demand. This is ReachOut Technologies. Now you did a Reg A to raise money, and that is over. Tell us about the Reg A.
Yeah, the Reg A was an interesting process because, I mean, I'm just a dude, right? I always say that. But when I say I'm just a dude, I'm a dude with a huge following now. You see me on News Nation, on Bloomberg, a lot of places that you're on too. But when I started this 12 years ago, it was right after I was laid off from a W-2 job and was just broke, went into foreclosure with my condo and was able to edge forward, go through a health crisis. I came out of that, man. I was like, you know what? A lifestyle business is not just what I want. I want to be able to impact as many people as I possibly can and help protect as many people as I can. And also show them that there can be wealth that's made, real wealth that's made. Because, the SBA, right, the Small Business Administration, they have, and this is getting into the Reg A, they have this stat, right, that says that the average small business owner, this was pre-COVID, it's probably worse now, was $59,900 a year. That's their take home. The average small business owner. And I see that hold true in the MSP industry because it's really, I see P&Ls all day long, man. My VP brings them to me of M&A, showing me these acquisition targets, and the owners are taking home like 80K a year. They've got a $2-3 million business and they're only taking home 80K. It's because their margins are just stupid thin, they're inefficient, they're technicians, they're not business people. They're not understanding how to scale.
Right.
So when I was approached with this, I spoke at an entrepreneurial event actually in the NASDAQ boardroom, and my face was on the Jumbotron for the first time in 2018. And it was that photo that caught the attention of this group and said, hey, we're looking into Reg A it was a business funding group to try to provide business funding. Would this be something you'd be interested in? And by the way, what would you use the money for? And I answered, I said, well, that's easy. I would go acquire other companies like mine. Like, really? We've vetted 13 others so far to try to pick our first client for this consultancy group. You're the first one that said that. You're the only one that said that you want to go out and grow by acquisition. Like, well, it just seems to make perfect sense to me. Because in my industry, there's a consolidation. There's a third of them that I believe are still going to go away in the next 3 years because you have to be large enough to compete now to even have the financial resources to get the protection and the tools and the people resources, the human capital, to even deliver these services. The Reg A, for anybody that's listening, Reg A is great in theory. I'm going to put it that way, right? Because it was put in by the Jobs Act by President Obama years ago. It's great in theory to go out and I'm sure you've talked about this too, right, Todd?
Yeah, I actually did a Reg A for when before I brought Alzheimer's Neuro public. I did a small Reg A. It was it's painful, but
it is painful.
Yeah. And we ended up raising, it's a lot easier for me to raise from institutions and high net worth. So I ended up raising, I think 4.6 million, then 8 million, then another 12, and then went public. The Reg A process was painful and laborious, and I've also discovered too that the average person who's putting in $1,000 into a Reg A, it's been my experience that if they're worried about that $1,000, they shouldn't put it in, kind of thing. And so it's a strange thing. I've had people. It's funny. The largest crowd I have of haters about my current company are always the guys that are gambling and buying like 1,000 shares of something at 20 cents and hoping it's going to 30. And yet I have people that have written checks for $50 million into the company over time.
And they don't say a word, do they? $70
million, and they call me once every couple weeks and say, "Hey, how are things going?" Or and so it's I'm sympathetic to what you're trying to do, and it's the democratization where you want to get a lot of people involved. It's a really noble cause, but individuals invest for multiple reasons, and I sympathize with what you're trying to do. Roll-ups are tough, but they can be very lucrative.
Yeah, for sure. I did shut down the Reg A, and that's because the group that I had to put it together, and this was kind of a warning sign, because I started to scratch my head and brought in a securities counsel that I trusted afterwards, rather than the one put together by this consultancy group that I hired. And it was around a third of the equity in the company, a third of the outstanding shares would have been delivered to the Reg A after, just for $6 million. That's all it was. So I did not raise much on this by intention after I recognized this, and I pulled it back.
Oh yeah, we only raised $78,000 for our first Reg A.
Yeah.
It's like it was chicken feed, right?
Yeah, right on. I think it was around 450K is what we ended up raising.
Oh wow, well that's good. That's a good Reg A.
I shut it down though because I'm like, I don't want to give away any more equity. So there's other options. We completed our first acquisition, but that was using mostly debt. And the reason being for these is because in this industry, like in the first 90 days as an example, because now that the strategy's changed a little bit, in the first 90 days of the acquisition, ReachOut typically has been in the 80 points of margin and higher, gross margin, right? The industry is like 50 to 55 on average. And this is because of efficiencies and procedures, everything else that I've done over the last 12 years. But in the first 90 days, took them from 55 to 70% gross margin through broad strokes.
Right.
And this is the beauty of economies of scale too, right? Because the infrastructure is already there. But this is what we're intending on doing is several of these a year. And within 3 years, we're intending to list on NASDAQ as well, to uplist at some point to NASDAQ, because that's the revenue will support it. The share price will just be through the roof. And then we do a full IPO after we've shown the track record. But now that I've done it, this is another interesting thing too. With the Reg A, it was very difficult to sell the story because I hadn't actually gone out and done the roll-up. I had a very mature MSP, over a decade, showed the efficiencies, showed the compound annual growth rate, and everything looks great. But then it was like almost like treated like a startup again by investors, by accredited investors, because like now I'm going to go out and do the same thing with another 20 of these. Like, well, that's great that you built this, but we don't really see that this could be successful for you to go out and do even one. So then it became, well, watch me, right?
Right.
I figured out a way to, and this will cash flow itself out in about 24 months. It's because of the increases in gross margin. So we're using the company's own cash flow, which this is an acquisition strategy.
Sure.
The company's own free cash flow to service the debt. And it's not a 10-year note or anything because this will be completely paid off in 2 years because of the increases in.
When you buy these
income.
MSPs, are they seller's notes?
Part of it is. Part of it is. We're still doing part stock, so it's a portion cash up front, a portion seller notes, and then a portion in stock in the public entity.
Right. I'm very familiar with it. I'm actually looking at MSP in Michigan as we speak, so I'm very familiar with the model. It's an interesting what these things trade for, and they're sort of mom and pop. They get to a certain size, like
they do.
1 to 7 million. They get to these sizes of MSPs, and then they really can't grow out any bigger than that, and so you got to retain them while you roll them into something. It's pretty ripe for a roll-up. There's no question about it. So.
It really is. And to give you an example, I've got some great news for you too out of this, right? Because we've been pushing first 90 days for this. And the recurring revenue has already been uplifted by about 20% because of the way that I structure these things. We already added back to the bottom line with some add backs over the first 90 days, reduction in expenses and payroll inefficiencies and all that by about another 25% itself.
Wow.
So it was about another 1.3 million that was added back to the bottom line. And just this week, we closed incrementally, meaning like on the books for this month, $2 million in additional revenue.
What's the typical kind of customer you look for? You said you added 2 million with one of your acquisitions recently in terms of new business. What does a typical business look like that you're doing business with in terms of customer-wise?
Yeah, it's a small business, small and mid-sized business, typically under 100 million in revenue, and anywhere between a headcount of 20 people to a couple hundred. You get above that and you really get into the enterprise IT space, and that's outside of what I look at as 70% of America, which is the small and mid-sized marketplace. And that's the underserved marketplace right now for all of this, because you can be a large corporation, right? I mean, 10,000, 20,000 employees, and you can go out and hire IBM. You can go out and hire the Hirschbeck Group. You can go straight to IBM Global Services if you want to. And those are the individuals that are meant to serve the enterprise space. But when it gets down, there's this big gap in serviceability between the big boys and the small businesses. And most of that's a financial gap, because the tools for this, man, and the way to deliver these, it's expensive. And ReachOut is one of the most. I mean, you understand the ramifications. Of course, we were talking 135K turns into a $1.35 million fraudulent wire.
Right.
That could just potentially disappear. And as those stories are proliferating a little bit more these days, the brevity of what this is starting to catch hold, but it's still going to take some time. So when we service, like the 2 million that I talked about, we just added, that was just with one single customer. And that's because we go in and identify, where I talked earlier with the 8% that actually know what they're doing. It's delivering those cyber services, because I'm looking for the MSPs that don't have a deep competency or a deep service offering in cyber. They're good at IT, right? They're good at going in and fixing the computers, running the servers, all of that, but they're not really good at keeping things safe and protected. We inject our services. And this is one single client that we added 2 million in revenue to, because they could not service them the way that they could before. They could service them in IT, but the cyber requirements they had, because this customer works with the Department of Defense, is now something that they can provide, and it was just an instant sale.
This is Department of Defense, though. They're having certain accountability standards changing, right, over time. Isn't that coming up?
Yeah, they sure are. It's called CMMC, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but there's different levels.
Right.
There's level 1, 2, and 3, and you're right, because this particular customer had a requirement of level 2.
Used to be like self-attestation that you were doing it, but now I understand within a few years, you're going to have to be audited by an outside firm.
You got it.
It's
That's
not
exactly
just,
it. Yep.
Not just you saying it's going to be the way it is. You have to actually have a third party audit and let you know that let the government know apparently that it's real.
Right on, yeah. And we'll see that in some different industries as well, specifically healthcare with other compliance needs with HIPAA. PCI has been doing it for years. There was a hospitality client that we had that we saved him, what was it? It was $6 million, because for every single credit card number that gets leaked to the dark web, PCI can fine you up to $500K. For every individual health record, like every single name. If Todd Ault gets out there, and it's so subjective too, man. This is the stupidity of it. They can say, well, show us what you've done so far to try to stop this, to try to prevent this. And they'll say, okay, well, this is a $100 fine, slap on the hand, whatever. Or HIPAA can say, this is a $1.5 million fine, because it was the worst type of negligence. You knew you had to abide by these regulations, these compliance requirements, but now you've done nothing. And they can fall anywhere in that scope. So if a small medical practice, right, they might be doing maybe 5 million a year, have a few doctors. This is the small business I'm talking about. If they have 10 names that are leaked, it could be up to $15 million in HIPAA fines.
Wow.
That shuts them down, man. They're done.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the business. We roll them up. Even if we didn't inject cybersecurity services, there's still the efficiencies and there's still the compound annual growth rate. A roll-up is a phenomenal way in any industry, I think, to just, it's not, I keep saying, it's not a new fancy magical business move. I'm just the first to do it in a public entity.
Yeah, those of you who don't know what we're talking about, a roll-up is where, let's say you're a veterinarian clinic and you get a strong entrepreneurial veterinarian or CEO type person who says, I'm going to go buy 20 veterinarian clinics. Here's the standard way I buy them, revenue, profitability, here's the shares I give out. You get economies of scale by buying a bunch of veterinary clinics, and then you get buying power, you can save costs, et cetera. And that's really one of the key elements of a roll-up. And they can work well, but you got to service the people you're acquiring. You got to make sure the CEOs that are selling to you are happy. So you usually have them roll some equity in the deal so they can't just walk away, as I call the elevator exit, where you buy their business and they can just press the elevator button and go down the elevator and they're gone. So you tie them into some sort of revenue sharing or participation in the future. Is that what you're doing right now?
That's exactly it, yeah. Because some of the seller notes on these, some of them will always be conditional. And
Right.
it depends on retention of specific revenue, you know, because if you look at the deals, and you've obviously been doing this a long time too, but for our listeners, there's one that we're looking at right now that we have probably 75% of the offer in a conditional seller note. And the reason being is because two of their clients, their whale clients, that make up 55% of their total revenue.
Yeah. Yeah, I always,
And in order to...
I've seen
Go
that.
ahead, man.
Sorry about that. You go ahead.
Yep.
The whale client, go ahead.
Yeah, that's anything over 10% is kind of our benchmark to say that will be carved out in a conditional seller note. Because typically speaking in my industry, not like the veterinary clinic that you're talking about, but there's usually contracts that exist, right, or terms in the MSP space. And a lot of times they're 1 year. But we like to see that from the buyer side. But as ReachOut exists as a whole, we actually don't really do contracts. It's one of our value propositions for competitive niches. With our competitors that are out there, we'll go in and say, we're just going to earn your service every single month, and our retention rate's 93%.
Right.
It's brilliant that way. You know,
Well,
it's similar to how
it's a
T-Mobile years
marketing-
ago
It's a marketing play, for sure, no question.
Yeah, it sure is.
You were
I like
saying
to see it on the buy side, though.
You were
I
saying
like to see
you were
the contracts.
You were saying it on the similar to another example. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're good, man. It is similar to the veterinary example that you brought up, because the owners typically with an MSP, with an IT firm, they're not very entrepreneurial, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just like a typical doctor or a veterinary doctor will not be very entrepreneurial. They're just opening a practice, right? Instead of working for another organization, they just took that and they're their own boss. And I've always touted the difference between an entrepreneur and a business owner, right? Because the entrepreneur is really thinking beyond where they're at. The business owner is pretty much just doing the job, but working for themselves. There's a difference that I've seen with those. But the veterinary clinic, you have an entrepreneur that comes out and says, I want to buy up 20 of these, like you said. That's exactly what I'm doing, just in the IT space.
So your business is providing IT services, cybersecurity, to individual businesses. That's your business. I've looked at this model pretty hard, and it's really like the now next utility. Remember, like in the beginning, and the people would not even believe this if I told them, but when you first got America Online, and you remember that $300 baud modem thing.
Yeah.
And people were like, I don't know what I would need that for. I'm just going to play games, or I'm going to go to America Online or whatever. But now you would never think about not having broadband service, right? As a modern day business, broadband service is a utility. And so what I'm learning about your industry is that MSP, managed service provider business, is like the new utility, where they have to pay their utility bill, they have to pay their health insurance bill, they have to pay for their broadband services. Not even telephone, because broadband can carry telephone, but they have to pay for MSP services because they need someone to keep their IT up and going and fluid, and that's a whole specialty department. So your business is becoming very utility-like in the sense that it's not even a question of need it, it's a question of who you're going to use. And so in the case of utility, I have to use Southern California Edison, let's say if I live in California, God help you. And in my case, I can only get Southern California if I lived in California. Yeah. But in your case, you're a utility that can be provided in terms of managed services, but you can be switched out. And you're saying, hey, we go month to month. So if you don't like us, you can replace us at any time.
Bingo. You got it.
So you're not locking them down, but in effect, you know how to manage all their IT, so they're kind of locked down because they got to start over if they go get someone else, right?
You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it.
That's,
and when I said the 93%, right, that is our retention rate. There was a client that moved on, he's maybe 6 months ago, I think is what it was. Doesn't happen often. And even in that process, because we're so good at the human side of technology, we said no problem. There was some personal stuff going on, you know, like wife had cancer. They were trying to get through some things. And while we don't do terms on our services, this is another sticky point, and it's actually a benefit for our clients. We do have terms on equipment because we don't sell equipment. To your point with a utility, it's very similar to like a diagnostic imaging place that has an MRI machine. That machine is what generates their revenue, but they don't purchase that machine. They rent it, right? It's not even like on a lease to buy scenario. They rent that equipment because every couple of years there's upgrades, there's better imaging technology. There's so much that's available to them to continue to actually charge more or charge less and increase the volume. It's the same with what we do. It'll be a hardware as a service to say, cool, you need 50 computers, they're all $69 a month. And by the way, the question comes up, it's like, well, what happens if we decide to leave you because there's no term on the services? I'm like, that's all good. You can just keep paying the rental bill for the 3 years for the equipment and use anybody else you want to. But then, of course, it still has our name on it. So then it is another sticky play. It's very similar to kind of the cell phone industry is the way that I've structured this, to the wireless industry. Because you can leave. You can totally leave T-Mobile and go to AT&T if you want to, but if you're on an installment plan for your iPhone, you have to either pay that iPhone off in order to actually own that device, or you can actually continue paying the monthly payments to T-Mobile and switch your phone over to AT&T. They don't care, but you still owe T-Mobile money for that device. It's the same type of scenario,
right?
But it keeps them sticky. And to your point, we're so deep in, and it's not a bad thing that we're so deep in. It's actually a good thing that we're so deep in because we develop that intimate knowledge too.
Right.
But if something happens like with this, it's like, you know what? I don't want to do that. That's fine. I don't even know if I'm going to be in business a year from now. I might want to try. It's like, no problem. Like, I'm just going to go with somebody else that's, you know, just less expensive that can just get me through the next year. That was the case with this particular client. It's like, no problem.
How do you decide that you want to be in business for yourself? Because, you know, it's probably one of the top questions I get. People say to me, I want you to mentor me. I want you to show me how you did it. And I'm like thinking to myself, I don't know where to. First of all, this isn't a teaching hospital. Second of all, you have to have a desire first. Like, I mean, that's the first thing, right? I have people all the time say to me, I want to be rich. I said, well, then you're not going to be rich.
Yep.
You want to be rich, you will not be rich. I always wanted to be wealthy because I grew up poor, but I put a number on it eventually because I knew what I wanted to do. But until I knew what I wanted to do, once I knew what I wanted to do, I always knew I would be rich. Like sort of like never, it's like a foregone conclusion.
It's almost like a symptom, like a side effect.
Yeah. How did you decide to be an entrepreneur? I think that this is the top question I get for people. And I wonder, like, you know, if you could tell us kind of how you got where you are, because you're your own business owner. And I think until you do that, it sounds sexy. It's a lot of work. It's more work than anyone can really imagine, but you've done it. You've been at it for a while. Tell people how you decided to do it.
Yeah, it's typical in my industry. It's like you get laid off, you start your own business, right? Because there's not a lot of industries you can do that with. And if you're a technician somewhere, if you're in IT, a lot will think it's like, oh, I can do this for myself. But typically speaking, that's never going to produce financial freedom when you have that kind of mindset to it. It was years before that actually happened. It was probably about 6 years before that I wanted to just build something that was bigger than me. And I know it sounds very noble, very high and lofty, but that was legitimately it. I still look forward to Payroll. I always do, because I'm able to influence the lives of everybody else. I could have a carpet cleaner business, right? And do a roll up with carpet cleaners. That'd be fine, because I'm trying to create wealth for everybody else. You know, it doesn't matter what it is. It's just, this is something that I already knew I was good at, and it's very strategic for me. So it keeps my mind going for where I need it.
How many employees do you have?
Right now I have 45
Nice.
with our roll up. Yep.
Nice.
Yep. And it's pretty awesome. And I know as we project this out, because we were just doing some pro formas here, looking at potential growth over the next couple of years. And by the end of 2025, we'll really be at about 500 as a very, very large MSP. As a publicly held MSP, a true publicly held MSP. And
Do you know Prescott, that firm Prescott in Michigan?
no, I haven't heard of them, no.
So that business, the business you're in is like really fragmented. And there's so much roll up.
Yeah.
There's so much roll up potential with what you're doing. So much. It's really like like if you look at like someone like Anderson, or some of the big players in this space, how big they've gotten in pure IT consulting. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
The opportunity of what you're doing is amazing. It's a really, I could talk to you about it all day but let's go back
What's
to the.
curious to me.
Go ahead.
Is that, and this has to do with why I started too, right? What's curious to me, because we're mentioning names like Anderson, I know, but you take a look at them and they're not really a household name. They're not a nationwide brand for small and mid-sized businesses.
Gemini is one of them.
Yeah, right on.
Right. Capgemini.
Most businesses, exactly, yeah. They'll be like, who do I call? I just got hacked.
Right.
Nobody knows.
Right.
So they'll start to Google, I just got hacked. What do I do? Or IT guy near me,
Right.
whatever it is, or computer services near me.
Right.
There's no household brand. And that's the mission that I'm on, because it gives people a sense of security and of safety.
Yeah, I like one thing you said though, and that is one thing that I've always prided myself on. It's a tricky thing because you want to keep the right balance of employees, but one of the things that motivates me the most is to see people's personal growth, right? So like my assistant is my niece. I've known her since she was 3. And I'm a little biased because she works with me every day, but there are people that have worked with me for 13, 15 years, 16 years. I've known them for 30. And I think by the time we complete our acquisition this Friday of a crane company in Texas, we're going to be at 515 plus employees, maybe more, maybe closer to 600. Now, unfortunately, I can say that since we bought those 4 hotels, I don't know most of our employees anymore. I probably know maybe 30, 35 of our 500 plus employees. But I do have a sense of pride that they all get paid and that they're, I'm getting to a point here, and that is, I wanted to know your experience from this, and that is, I have this philosophy that no one can give me advice on how to run my business unless they've had to make a payroll. And let me get to my question, and that is, I remember hiring these 4 guys from Harvard, and one of them worked for GE, and it was like, I managed a payroll of $1 billion and this and that. And what I discovered is when you have an institutionalized service where you're put in charge of managing, you're really a manager. You never had to make a payroll. You didn't have to come up with the money. For you, what was your scariest time where you had to come up with money to make a payroll? Did you ever have those moments where you didn't think you could make the payroll? Because to me, making a payroll changes you from a guy who's a manager, a worker, an employee, to someone who owns a business. When you have to make that payroll and people are responsible for, you're responsible for them. If you don't pay them, they can't buy food.
You got it. It is that deep and hardcore too. Because there have been a couple of times I've never missed a payroll, yet there's been many times I haven't paid myself in order to make that payroll.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Yeah, and that's because, I do see myself, just like you're saying, as responsible for the livelihoods of everybody else that works for me. And it brings me so much fulfillment and joy, and also like a sense of purpose too, to be able to be that person that can actually provide for them. Now they're working, they're earning their wage and everything else.
Sure.
The structure and the foundation to do that is something that I'm able to provide. And it's a small group of people, man, and this is not arrogance, this is just fact, right? I had a coach a long time ago help me with that. I'm like, I don't want to sound too arrogant. He's like, well, is it fact? He's like, well, then it's not arrogance, it's just truth. I'm like, perfect.
Wait, I got to remember that. Hold on.
Yeah,
the
you like
editor
that?
who just did that. Let's cut that piece out. We're going to put that piece in again. This is an important part because when I speak of something that's fact, it's not arrogance.
Exactly. It's just truth.
Just
Right
truth.
Yep.
Skylar, you got to mark that down, Skylar, because I got to tell you, this is one of my number one issues. Is like it sounds arrogant. I'm like, I'm not trying to be arrogant. It's a fact.
Yeah, exactly. And I stopped worrying a lot about that years ago too, and it was because of the help of this coach. Because I never wanted to be seen as someone who was unattainable, unapproachable, always relevant to everybody else that's around me.
You got a number? You got a go-to book? Like you say, coach. I hear you talking about coaching. You got a go-to book or thing you like to listen to refresh you?
I listen to audiobooks a lot. Napoleon Hill is still one of my absolute favorite authors.
There you go, baby.
Yeah.
Greg Reed's a personal friend. He runs he writes for the Napoleon Hill Foundation, and he is.
That's awesome.
He and I are doing a deal together right now. I'm a big fan. So you talk about all of them or just the original? What do you like?
All of them. I love all of them. The most recent one that I listened to twice, because when I work out, I listen to the books, and that's my feeding time, right? My consumption time. It's podcasts, it's audiobooks that I'll listen to there. I've never been one to be able to sit down and open a paper book. But I need to consume knowledge, so this keeps thoughts going. I'll have my notes app open while I'm lifting. It works out well. Outwitting the Devil was my most recent one, and that book is just amazing.
Outwitting the Devil.
Outwitting the Devil. Yeah, it's incredible. You've got to listen to this or read it. It's just insane because it's about an interview almost with the devil, but the devil is personified as really like your own self-limiting beliefs. And how he's able to get into the mind, whether you believe in this, in that the devil's a person or not, you can believe in your own subconscious, which can be the comparison to this in the way that your subconscious is literally meant to keep you alive, right? That's the reason it exists, is to keep you away from just doing very bad things to yourself, whether it's physical, mental, whatever. But that's also a source of fear and self-limiting beliefs to keep you from doing what you should do. And that's the interview that takes place in this book, but it's incredible. When you're talking about the payroll scenario, it's like that's what I keep playing out in my mind. It's like, so what do I need to do? And that's what it comes up to, right? So if you're 2 weeks away and you're saying, wow, the cash is not there. The cash is simply not there to make payroll. If it's a $5 million company and you've got $5,000 in the operating accounts, which I've been there, man, for real, I've been there. It's like, what do I need to do? I got 2 weeks. And in the words of an advisor of mine, at that point, he's like, well, Rick, just go out and sell some shit. And I'm like, that's great.
Sales solves a lot of problems, man. Sales solves a lot of problems. Exactly.
Right on. But to your point, like no one else bears the emotional load that the founder does.
No.
And that's the part that whether it's payroll or anything else, that's what anybody else who's not a founder doesn't fully realize. And there's cool people though, man, because they can work for you. Like I've got a couple people that work for me that they're this phrase like an intrapreneur, to where they can help share some of that load. Internally. Some of the emotional load. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And even though they're not responsible for payroll, you can see the emotional connection that they have in helping to share and support the rest of the people in the organization. That part's pretty cool to find a couple of those to get in your circle.
Right. I find myself every once in a while, something business is going on. I happen to be one of the top Bitcoin miners in the country. And about a year and a half ago, I couldn't get a loan from any of the people that are all going out of business now. They're all calling me saying, hey, can you help us out? I'm like, no. But the reason why no is because obviously we got to keep our own ship from taking on water, and we're just not in a position to do that kind of thing. But I find myself like going through founder's depression, just little bits of it, right? And for me, it lasts about 24 hours. I won't really let it go further and wallow in feeling sorry for myself for longer than about 8 to 12 to 24 hours, maybe usually a weekend or something, maybe some meditation or just reading a book or something. And I too am audiobook. So to me, reading is the same thing as listening, but it is what it is. I meant audiobooks because I don't read anything really. But I wonder, do you find yourself like when you're stressed out, giving yourself a little, you know where you're going to be down about something, and how long does it take you to recover?
Yeah, it's gotten to that short period of time now, and sometimes it can be 24 hours, sometimes it can be 2 hours. It was years ago, which you probably relate to this, years ago, to where you were not as aware of what that scenario is, founder's depression, and you let it go days or weeks or months.
Right.
And you start to see the dips. But now I've been recognizing this, especially over the last couple of years with pushing this company towards a public offering and a roll-up. Every time I've run into a block and I would recognize where that founder's depression is, now I can recognize it within a few minutes.
Right.
But 3 years ago when I started this, it was like the 24 hours, maybe 96 hours, where I would start to see, and it's like, man, this is such a huge obstacle that's in my way right now.
Right.
How do I overcome this? And you just start to wallow in this, I don't know if it is, how can it be? And I'm one of the most positive thinkers that exists, even from a realistic perspective. And I was just telling my new controller who started today, and he's like, I'll be the pessimist because I'm the finance guy, right?
Yeah,
and I'm like, no, he's like, but there's risk. I'm like, well, to me, risk is just simply averting the blind spots. Because if I'm saying there's an outcome, I'm saying that's gonna fucking happen.
Right.
Right. And Kevin Harrington, the original shark, is on my board. It took him 2 years. He said no to me originally as I was trying to take the company even to just Reg A. But when he introduced me on stage one time, he's like, you know what, the reason I really paired up with Rick is because everything he said was going to happen actually did happen. And I watched him for 2 years.
Yeah, I would say to you that's probably my biggest hurdle with people is I tell them this is what we're going to do, and then they say you're too optimistic, and I say we're doing this, and it takes. Now I'm driving. I used to drive a speedboat, but now I'm driving more like a big cruise liner, and so if you turn right or left too hard, people fly off the sides, right? The deck chairs fly off the boat, and so you got to turn a little slower, but. I definitely, I try to give people this analogy, and that is, if you're pushing a rock uphill and you need it to roll over the other side, that founder's depression is where you're pushing it and it slides back a little bit, but you stop it. But now you still have to push that same distance a little bit, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you're like,
it's like 2 steps back, 5 steps forward.
Exactly. You're like, so you do your Reg A and you think that's the thing that's going to get you to the promised land, and then you're disappointed about the Reg A, so you stop the Reg A and you go down the route of maybe a 506B and you raise some money from friends and family, and you decide, well, I don't have enough of them, and you go to a brokerage firm, a bank that's going to raise you money, and you find out that they really can't, they don't have the swagger to pull it. I've been using this one guy for a long time, and he's incredibly expensive. He used to say to me, I don't know if I should even use these words. He used to say that I'm what do I say here? He used to say that I'm going to charge you a lot of money and it's going to be obscene. I'm editing what he used to say to me. It's going to be obscene, but I'm going to get the deal done. And I used to say to him, he's crazy for the amount of money he charges. But now I don't even question it because he closes every deal that I've ever brought to him, which may be a chance for you and I to do business. I don't know who's bringing you public, but trust me, I've raised myself for the company I run in the last 3 years, close to $500 million.
I like leaving people inspired, and this is what I think we were getting to.
Did you answer the question though? How did you decide to go into business for yourself?
Not specifically, and I guess in a roundabout way I did. It was around. I always wanted to do something that was bigger than me because I wanted to be responsible for a lot of people and help their livelihoods. Even before I started this.
But you were already in IT though? But you were already in IT and you got laid off?
Yeah, I was.
Okay.
Yep. I was in IT. I started in sales actually with Radio Shack, and I saw the amount of commissions that could come in because I learned sales really young. At 17 years old, and as a 17-year-old making a $30K commission check over Christmas, which is freaking amazing. Right, just selling phones. Back then there were penny phones and people buying batteries in a Radio Shack. Everyone would be like, hey, you want a cell phone for a penny to go with that? Because I learned that from McDonald's, no joke. Like, they'd come through the drive-thru when I was 15 and they'd buy like a drink, right? They'd just get like a Coke and I'd be like, you want fries with that? Like, yeah, I could use some fries. And I learned very fast that it's literally just the amount of questions that you ask. So if you hit every single person with sales, it doesn't even matter if they're going to buy or not. You know that you're going to hit numbers if you ask the question to every single person.
I like this guy a lot. Yeah, dude, I started working at Petland and I learned I learned how to sell, and they taught you like, hey, you're going to need a dog bone with this. You're going to need a dog bowl. Here's the kind of food you should feed him. Oh, by the way, does he have a toy and a bed? And by the time you're done, that dog's $2,000.
Right on. You got it.
Yeah.
I was the very first Geek Squad agent in Chicago when Best Buy acquired Geek Squad. They were rolling it out. There were 7 test stores across the nation, and it was the same story. You know, corporate would come down. I was 22 years old, and they're like, how is it that this IT guy who's a geek has 3 times the average per ticket price of everybody else, the other 6 test stores? So I told them the same story. I'm like, have you ever worked for McDonald's? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, here's another thing I learned throughout the years. If you're already in a place to where the customer has already passed the transaction mark, they've already made one purchase.
Right.
Their brain is already in that mode to where they will buy more. They absolutely will buy more.
And the human condition is that if you ask, after they've made a commitment to a purchase, and you ask them if they want something additional, they will usually want to reward themselves, so they do it anyways.
You got it.
Yeah. I'm sorry about that. I love that. I love the process of sales a lot, for sure.
Same. And it's simple too. Whether it's high ticket, low ticket, it's all really the same thing. You know, it's just making sure that you always ask the same questions every single time. You always ask for the order.
So is ReachOut raising money? Is there a way for a person to invest in your company?
Publicly, there's not right now, but privately, because we're looking at potentially a listing on the OTC at the moment, privately we do have convertible note options because we did shut down the Reg A specifically to go to the next level. And when you ask, it's like, how do you get past that founder's depression? It's one statement that I tell myself every single time if I run into a roadblock. It's, Rick, you're thinking too small.
Right. Yeah, I think you're thinking too small right now. There's a lot of SPACs out there. There's a lot of opportunity if you go to the New York Stock Exchange or the Amex, the New York American or the NASDAQ. I don't know how big you are size-wise, but I've done a lot of deals. I just put money into a company, gave them a bridge loan, brought them public on the NASDAQ on Friday called Adamas One. They're a lab-grown diamond company that went public on Friday. The symbol's Jewel, Jewl. And I provided them capital, and they ultimately went public. And
that's awesome.
People really do underestimate where they can be and what cycle they need to be in, right?
Yeah.
I always say pursue the capital you need and the outcome will get there, right? Someone said, I can do it for 20 million, but I could really get done with it for 5. Well, then don't talk about 20, get 10, right? Get what you need plus some, right, to get that done. So,
right on.
Right.
That's the route I'm taking right now. I've got a couple of things in the hopper at the moment to do exactly that. But yeah, I'd love to have the conversation.
What are the sales? What's your sales size now? Like in terms of annual sales, what are you doing?
Yeah, our run rate's 10 million post-acquisition.
You guys can go public.
Annually.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, that's what everybody's telling me.
Yeah, forget the OTC. Don't even think about the OTC. I'm not joking around.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even waste my time. I wouldn't waste my time one bit. I wouldn't waste 1 ounce of energy on the OTC. I'd go directly to the NASDAQ.
All right. Well, maybe that's happening then.
I don't mean to be. I don't mean to be like rude. I mean, we don't know each other.
No, you're the second person that's told me this.
Listen. Look at my resume. I mean, 33 years. I've been an activist shareholder. I've taken over many public companies by force or by kindness. I just took over the largest. I just took over the largest karaoke company in the world, MICS on the NASDAQ. I bought them in 9 days before I had to file that 13D. And I would say to you, I'm not bragging, it's a fact. I've done a lot of deals.
Yeah.
And I would just tell you the OTC is painful. Reversing on the OTC is painful. It's my experience. If you're doing 10 million, you got a 10 million run rate, and you have a strategy and a plan, a guy like you who's focused on the strategy and the plan, just needs sponsorship behind him, just needs dollars to make sure you can go execute on your plan, right?
Yeah, right on.
It's usually just a conversation about dollars and what size the company can be. And you're creating a utility that's sticky and not going to go away.
Bingo.
Yeah. Okay, so I appreciate your time, Rick, today. I know that we talked a lot about business, but I liked where this was going because you're talking about someone who's actually doing it. How does someone find out about you? Where do they see your podcast? How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, podcast is on all platforms. Apple and Spotify, of course, are the biggest ones. Just All In with Rick Jordan. My biggest social media following is on Instagram, at Mr. Rick Jordan.
At Mr. Rick Jordan?
Yep, you got it.
Do we? Oh, I think we follow each other already, don't we?
I believe we do, yeah, as of a couple days ago.
I saw that. Yeah, I saw that for sure. All right, we're going to put all that up there so you can, so people can follow you and stuff like that. What kind of? I mean, it looks like to me you work with entrepreneurs besides your day-to-day daily bread business.
Yeah.
What do you do in the entrepreneurial world? Are you coaching? What are you doing?
Yeah, I do have a coaching program that I'm launching here in January, and I've had one specifically for MSPs, but how I get contacted a lot through DMs is general entrepreneurs. I love it, man, because it's a lot of those that are like between 18 and 32 years old are the ones that contact me, and they're like, how do I do this? Here's what I'm thinking. Can you help me? So now it's like, if I can use a little bit of my time to help a lot of people, that's what I'm going after.
Appreciate it, Rick. Everybody, Rick Jordan, thanks so much, my man.
Thanks.
I'm going to explain to you real quick. But don't be rolling yet. There's a reason for it.
So I did get that right. I did get that right.